Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session organised by the University of Sheffield and the SPERI, which is the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Sheffield, in association with the Institute for Public Policy Research and its Commission on Environmental Justice. We are delighted to be part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science, which is an annual festival of public events of various kinds, which the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, encourages universities to put on to showcase the kind of social science that is being done at university and how relevant it is to the rest of the world. SPERI, just to tell you a little bit more about SPERI, is a leading research institute on political economy, which you can understand as the interdisciplinary study of the politics of the economy and of economic policy. And we do that in the UK and globally. And we are particularly concerned to try and make our research more widely accessible beyond universities and academia, and to make it impactful in the world of policy and public debate. My name is Michael Jacobs. I'm a professor of political economy in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield, and a professorial fellow at SPERI. The reason we're associating with the IPPR and its commission, its Environmental Justice Commission, is that both I and two of our speakers sat on that commission. It did a little bit more than a year's work, actually, to look at how we could move towards net zero in a fair way, involving members of the public. What made it, I think, distinctive is that we conducted a number of citizens' juries, groups of lay people around the country, who spent a number of weeks and weekends discussing with experts how we can move to net zero. And the conclusions of the commission were very much informed by that exercise in kind of participative democracy. Our report, which was published in the summer, is entitled Fairness and Opportunity, a people-powered plan for the green transition. And it's available on the IPPR website, which is ippr.org. So tonight's event is called Beyond COP26, the political economy of net zero. At COP26, which I'm sure many in our audience were following in one way or another, you may have heard the UK government boast that, particularly after India's announcement there, 90% of the global economy is now under a net zero target. Today, everybody, it seems, is in favor of net zero, a concept that was only really invented, at least in social science and politics, about 8 years ago. But our aim this evening is to explore what net zero really means and what will be involved here in the UK in achieving it. And we'll be looking at this from a variety of different perspectives. We have a superb panel of contributors. So I'd like to introduce them briefly and to say thank you to all of them for agreeing to do this with us. So our first speaker is Bianco de Farias Leti, who is senior analyst at the Climate Change Committee, which you will know is the UK's independent advisory body for governments, in fact, throughout the UK, all the four governments on climate change policy. Bianca was formerly at the National Infrastructure Commission, where she was responsible for modelling infrastructure needs across a number of sectors. At the Climate Change Committee, she specialises in the economic impacts of climate action. She will talk a little bit about what she does there. David Simons is Director of Sustainability at WSP, which is a specialist engineering company and the world's largest environmental and sustainability advisory practice. WSP has been the lead designer on iconic projects such as the Shard, rail projects such as HS2, on a number of energy projects around the world. It has about 55,000 staff around the world. David leads WSP's program called Future Ready, and one of his tasks is to halve the carbon footprint of the company's designs and advice over the next decade on the way to net zero. He was recently voted Business Green's Leader of the Year, and he was a member of the Environmental Justice Commission. Paul Novak is Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, which is the UK's Federation of Trade Unions, 48 trade unions, 5.5 million working people. He was formerly a union activist in both the public and private sectors. and he's done a number of jobs at the TUC. He works on industrial strategy, on organisation, on the TU's operations in the nations and regions. He was a member of the Green Jobs Task Force that the government set up, and also the IPPR Commission. And our fourth speaker is Emma Fletcher, who is chair of the Swaffham Prior Community Land Trust. This land trust, community land trust, is a community company in the village of Swaffham Prior in East Cambridgeshire, and it's run by volunteers, including Emma, who've built 8 homes for the village and kick-started a community heating scheme. Over the last few years, Emma and her colleagues at the Land Trust, the Community Land Trust, have been working alongside Cambridgeshire County Council and a team of consultants to deliver a community renewable energy scheme to take the village off oil and electric heating. It's not on the grid. In her day job, Emma is the managing director of Evora Homes, a housing developer owned by 4 housing associations in the region. So our format this evening is that I'm going to ask each of the speakers an opening question about what net zero means for them in their work. And then we're going to have a bit of a discussion amongst the panel on some key aspects of the issue. I shall then open it up to questions from the floor, from you, the audience. If you'd like to ask one, there is a Slido device on your YouTube channel. So please enter your questions for that. And Lynette, who has helped to organize, Lynette Hodges, who's helped to organize this session, is going to kind of moderate the questions, and then we'll take some during the latter part of the session. So I hope that makes sense. We've got an hour, actually now slightly less than an hour. So let's go first to Bianca Letti, if we may. Perhaps I can start with you. You're an economist. You are an analyst for the Climate Change Committee. You were recently, the Climate Change Committee was told to tell government how it should reach net zero. The government legislated to put net zero by 2050 into UK law under the Climate Change Act, and the Climate Change Committee was asked to advise government on how that could best be reached. So how do you go about doing that in lay people's terms?
Thanks, Michael. I'll do my very best to try and explain what is, I guess, the bread and butter of what I do in layman's terms. So as you say, I'm an economist at the Climate Change Committee. So unsurprisingly, a lot of the work that I do centers around the costs and benefits of net zero and climate action in general. And as you also said, our advice at the CCC is to give advice, our job at the CCC is to give advice to government on climate targets. So the first question we always get asked in relation to a target is, how much is it going to cost? So way back in 2019, before we even had the net zero target, that's what we set about doing, looking at how much it would cost to achieve net zero and also what the benefits of that would be. So we have a particular way of looking at the cost of climate action, which isn't necessarily intuitive when you're not familiar with it. And that is comparing costs to a hypothetical world in which climate change doesn't exist, and we're therefore not trying to reduce our emissions. So we always start off by setting out what would happen in this world with no climate action. So we carry on burning fossil fuels, driving as much as we do, that kind of thing. We then look at the options that we have available to do things in a low carbon way rather than the high carbon way, which is the counterfactual. And the options that we have tend to focus around new technologies and behavior change. So to make this a little bit more real, for example, rather than driving a car that uses petrol or diesel, we can drive an electric car. So that's the low carbon technology replacing the high carbon one. But then we can also drive less and walk and cycle more so that we need less energy overall to power our car. And that's the behavioral side of things. So to achieve net zero, we need a combination of both of those types of actions. So to work out the costs from that, we then have to look at the difference in the costs of the high carbon option and the low carbon option. So sticking to the example of the cars that I mentioned before, at the moment, electric cars are still more expensive to buy than petrol or diesel cars. So the difference in cost to buy an electric car and a diesel car is what we consider to be the cost of climate action. But that's just kind of the upfront cost of buying the car. There's also the cost of running the car, so filling it up with petrol or charging it with electricity in the low carbon option, and also the cost of maintaining it. And electric cars are actually cheaper to run and to maintain. So in this case, we'd have a saving which we deduct from that cost, the upfront cost that I mentioned. So to work out the cost of net zero, what we have to do is add up the costs of each of the actions that we have to undertake in the economy, of all those measures. So in the transport sector, that's adding up the costs of decarbonizing every single car, but then every HGV, every train, every bus. And then there's the cost of decarbonizing all the other sectors too, so buildings, agriculture, industry, etc. So we think at the CCC that after adding all that up, achieving net zero still costs less than 1% of GDP each year. And that's the cost side. Obviously, there's also the benefits, which are really significant. And the big one is clearly avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. So we're already seeing some of those today. And there are more hazards that are already baked in even to a 1.5 degree world. But clearly, the higher the temperature gets, the more hazards that we'll get, like floods, heat waves, droughts. And the more it'll cost us as a society to deal with all those issues. And there's other benefits on top of that too. So better health from better air quality, from more cycling and walking, from healthier diets. We'll have more green space to enjoy, which benefits our well-being. But these things are all harder to monetize than the costs. But we think that actually they are very likely to outweigh the costs if we were to monetize them. And this conclusion was recently echoed by the Treasury in their review of net zero. And I think it's worth noting, it's certainly no small thing for a finance ministry to recognize this. It's not where we were a few years ago, at least. So all that work tells us that the aggregate cost of net zero, say, is less than 1% of GDP, which is important for governments making high-level decisions about targets, but to most people is pretty meaningless. So how much is 1% of GDP? It's hard to grasp the meaning of a number like that. So what people are interested in, understandably, is whether this will increase their energy bills, whether it'll affect the job they do, that kind of thing. So now what I spend most of my time thinking about is the impact of these changes on different groups, because they clearly won't affect everyone in the same way. Some businesses might be more affected than others, some people, some regions. So the distribution of these costs and benefits is as important, if not more, as the aggregate impacts that I've just talked about. And that's the kind of thing that I'm lucky enough to get to spend the next few months thinking about at the CCC.
And I'm going to ask you about, but not now. But in the discussion, I want to ask about those distributional costs. Basically, who is paying the costs and who is getting the benefits and how you work that out. Okay, let's get a different perspective. David, you work in a business which is committed to decarbonisation, and you work for businesses in a whole variety of sectors. What does net zero mean to you? What does this mean for the work that you actually do in your day job?
Yeah, hi, Michael. So look, I think for me, the thing that I spend most of my time working on is seeing net zero as a business growth opportunity. And so for us in WSP, we look at net zero from three perspectives. So first of all, the sheer challenge and the work that, as Bianca was talking about, that has to go on requires huge amounts of planning, it requires huge amounts of design, and that represents fantastic new business opportunities for WSP with our experts to design that. Secondly, in every project that we do, we have an opportunity to be at the forefront of designing lower carbon solutions, whether it's a net zero project or not. And you alluded to the halving the carbon footprint of our designs and advice by 2030. That's a unique perspective and a unique position that we have taken in the engineering sector, and it's helping to set us apart. And then thirdly, our own operations, our offices, our travel, the greenhouse gas emissions from our staff working from home. We have set a carbon target that's called a science-based target, where we have committed that we will cut that by an amount that limits our share of global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that can be really imaginative. We've got guides working with our teams, helping them reduce carbon from their home working. We also have challenged our teams to when they are traveling, as they're coming back to more and more, to travel by train rather than by flying if they do need to travel. And we've done that by putting a £200 levy on any flight that our UK teams take, and that goes to fund our social foundation. It's cost neutral in the business. It's cut even before the pandemic. When we did it, it cuts our UK flying by 75%, and it's been really engaging. So to summarize, I mean, why are we doing this as a business? I mean, of course, because it's the right thing to do. We are a global leading business. We absolutely want to play our part. But the fundamental point for us is, by taking a leadership position on this, this helps us grow. The Future Ready programme, again, that you talked about with net zero, that's helped us win £600 million of work in the business this year. I have no difficulty creating a business case for that. It helps us give really great quality work for our staff, and it helps us grow that. And perhaps most importantly as well, it also gives our people tremendous purpose. And our people, we all want to have a purposeful job that is having impact and is having meaning. And so for us, we are finding that by being a leading organization in our space, by having a high profile on net zero, by being leaders in this area, by setting that out really clearly, that is attracting great people. And I get several emails, and my colleagues get several emails to say, you know what, I have 3 job offers and I joined WSP because of the purpose that your net zero leadership brings. And that for us, Michael, in a summary, is what net zero is for WSP.
That's really interesting. Thank you, David. And this leads us nicely on to Paul. So David is in the fortunate business of being a business that makes money out of doing the right thing for net zero. And for every business, every regulation, every tax, whatever, there are business beneficiaries of those things, because products and services have to be provided to help us get towards net zero. And your members in the TUC and in your member unions will have members working for businesses like WSP, but you will also have business members working in businesses that might, at least in principle, be thought to be threatened by net zero, in heavy manufacturing, in the oil and gas sector, and so on. How does the TUC and its member unions think about net zero?
Well, thanks, Michael. I mean, I think our starting point is that we're interested in what can we do in the here and now, really, to, yes, decarbonise our economy, but also secure a just transition for working people, their families and communities. And, you know, as you said, this matters directly to the sort of tens of thousands of people that we represent in energy-intensive industries, carbon-intensive industries, the energy industry itself, but it also matters actually to our members. It doesn't matter whether you work in a care home or a car factory, climate change makes a difference. And again, it's important to think beyond those, you know, beyond steel, beyond automotive, beyond chemicals. Our public services account for something like, well, just short of 10% of our emissions year on year as well. So this matters to all of our members. But the crucial thing for us, Michael, is about securing that just transition, because we've seen industrial transitions managed badly in the past or not managed at all. And I think we've got a responsibility at the TUC to set out to working people how this is going to work for them and how they're going to be involved. And so 3 key things for my mind. One is just continuing to make the case for government to step up its level of investments in the green economy and to step up its level of investments in net zero. I mean, you mentioned before, you know, we were both, along with David, on the IPPR's Commission on Environmental Justice. I was on the government's Green Jobs Task Force. And actually, I think there's a growing consensus. I mean, it's expressed in different ways. I think in the IPPR, we talked about the need for the government to invest £30 billion a year. The Green Jobs Task Force encouraged the government to think about coming up to at least the G7 level average in terms of investment in the green economy. At the TUC, we called on the government to put in £42 billion a year over the next 2 years alone to kickstart our sort of the creation of green jobs. But whichever way you put it, it's about investing in the economy. And for us, it's also crucially, in terms of just transition, investing in retooling, re-engineering our carbon-intensive industries. I don't want us to get to net zero on the back of deindustrialization. I think that's really important. It means investment in things like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. The second key thing for us is about worker voice and people being involved and having a sense of agency at every level in this transition, whether it's the practical work our unions are doing right now in terms of reaching agreements with employers about what the transition will look like, what it means for jobs, for reskilling and so on, right through to, and again, I think this is expressed in different ways by the IPPR Commission and by the Green Jobs Task Force and by the TUC and others, but some sort of just transition commission where we're bringing together employers and unions to make sure that we are delivering net zero in a way that supports working people. And maybe the third and final point, Michael, and obviously happy to get into all of this as we get into the conversation, but you know, for me, you don't get just transition unless you have a real focus on making sure that green jobs are good jobs, and not every green job is a good job at the moment. And it doesn't matter whether it's part of offshore wind or efforts around reforestation or retrofit and insulation. Some of that is low paid, insecure work. And actually, I think if we're going to take working people with us, we have to set out how actually all of that investment, both public and private, is being used in a way that does create, protect, sustain good quality jobs, and that's going to be really important. If you want to really convince somebody working in the oil and gas industry that you're serious about protecting the interests of them and their family and getting to net zero, then you have to set out what the alternatives look like in a very real, concrete way, rather than giving them vague hope of a green job tomorrow that might be, of a poorer quality. So, as I say, Michael, happy to get into all of this, but I mean, for me, it is about securing that just transition and taking the practical action at a workplace level up that's going to help deliver that.
Great, thank you. And one of the interesting elements of the COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was agreed there, was the language around just transition, which was a language invented by the trade union movement. I think the International Trade Union Confederation was the first kind of organization to use that, and that has now entered into international climate agreements. We're going to come back to that, I'm sure. I now want to ask Emma, who is operating at a very different level. David works globally. Bianca and Paul principally nationally. Emma, you're working in a small village, a village that is so small that it's off the grid. And you're working as a volunteer with the Community Land Trust. And then particularly on this incredibly interesting project you're working on to try and effectively bring a district community heating scheme, renewable heating scheme, to a village that is largely heating using oil for heating. Does net zero as a concept, as a kind of highfalutin abstract concept, mean anything in what you're doing? Or is that just, even though people might say that's what you're doing, is that just not the way you and your friends and colleagues and members of the village think about it?
It couldn't be further from the truth. Net zero is a million miles away from our little community and our village. Nobody is thinking about it at that scale. It's all about people on telly doing protests and supergluing themselves to roads. It is so far away from where we are. And at the end of the day, climate change for a lot of people is what China should be sorting out, not at community level. And it comes back to the point that Bianca made about behavioural change. This is going to be really challenging. Our project actually started out as a fuel poverty project. As you mentioned, we're on oil. We will have the fluctuations literally on a daily basis with the oil industry prices, which is very difficult for people, especially on low incomes, to budget for. So that was where we started, having delivered some homes to the village. That has progressed and we came into the heating project. So just a brief overview of the project. We're all on oil or electric heating. It's very expensive. We have 44 out of the 300 homes in the village are with one large housing association. And then we've got about another 10 to 15 more. So a high percentage of people are in affordable housing in our village, those on low incomes. And so therefore we decided that we would actually look at putting in something far more sustainable that didn't revolve on global prices. So some taking an impact that's globally, but bringing it down locally. And so now we've got 130 ground source boreholes going into the ground. We've got an energy centre with industrial air source coming from Denmark. And we've got a private wire to a secure solar farm off-site, which is giving us a guaranteed stable electricity price to run it. That pipe will run around people's homes and take away all the oil boilers. So that's on the technical side. That's what we're doing. However, in terms of going forward, we've had grants to help us to get to here. No other community has done this at this scale with this number of different ownerships and different types of properties in a historic setting with a conservation area, with listed buildings, etc. And it has been challenging. It's taken us 4 years to get to now when spades are going into the ground and the energy centre is going up. But the amount of abuse that we have received from the community has been huge. We've had support as well, but people are saying, well, why should I change? Why should I change? I buy my electricity. It's 100% of a green supplier. I don't think you should have grant. We think the grant should go to the NHS. It's a specific grant for energy projects, but there's a lot of people that use a positive as a negative to justify why they don't have to change and why they don't have to come together. But for us, this is about community change. It's that community pressure that you need to get collective change. It's at really basic level. You know that you put your bin out in the morning of bin day, and by night, one of your neighbours will glare at you if you haven't brought your wheelie bin back in again. It's that collective, why aren't you changing conversations in the pub that are bringing people on board. But if it was a political delivery, I'm not sure it would have got this far, because, you know, elections count for people, votes count for people, and we have had to drive and strive forward with baby steps to get to this point and achieve. Now, the best thing is it's a great example, and we happily talk to whoever to show this example, and so other people will be able to come and see it. But I really don't think government can underestimate how people do not want to change. For those of you who are excited and probably have never read this, the government's currently consulting on a rather snappy titled "Phasing Out the Installation of Fossil Fuel Heating in Homes Off the Gas Grid." And it's a major document that closes on the 16th of January. They want to end the use of all fossil fuel heating in all homes off grid by the late 2030. So there's a lot of talk about gas, but there's not a lot of talk about oil and electric. And when they use words like high energy, high carbon fuels, nobody thinks, well, that affects me. They think that's somebody else's problem. And so language is key, I think, in how we're going to see this change.
Thank you. I want to ask you one more question, because in the original blurb for publicity blurb for this session, and actually one of somebody originally who was we were hoping to get for this, we talked about the Green New Deal. Now that's another highfalutin phrase. In a word, Emma, is Green New Deal any more useful to you than net zero or not?
No, totally useless at local level, because people don't know how it means to them and their house. And actually, we can build as many nice, new, shiny net zero passive house homes, but there's a darn sight more existing homes out there that need to be altered, retrofitted, etc. And there's a paper Cambridge City Council did that reckons about £55,000 minimum per private home will need to spend to get to net zero. And again, that really hasn't been monetarised to people on the ground, that this is their future.
So this is fantastic to have this perspective, you know, with what we academics like to call real people, and their understanding of this. Bianca, that takes me beautifully back to you, because you mentioned the fact that one of the things that you look at on the Climate Change Committee is what a social scientist would call the distributional impacts. That is, who is paying and who is getting benefit, and how are those benefits and costs distributed. I want to ask you a specific kind of question about not how you do it, but what the results are. Many people, I think, are worried that greening our economy, greening our energy system, is basically going to mean higher prices, for example, energy prices. And those will disproportionately impact poorer people who spend a higher proportion of their income on their energy bills than richer people do. Similarly, with greening a vehicle, you know, it's expensive to buy an electric vehicle. It may well be cheaper over the whole lifetime, but if you haven't got that money up front because you haven't got any savings or you haven't got much income, then effectively you're penalising people on low incomes. What is your advice as a climate change committee to government on how to make it fairer, if you like, how to minimize those costs falling on the people who can least afford it? Are there policy ways that you can do that?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. So it's hard to say who's going to pay for it, because there isn't a natural place where costs fall. So it's all down to the choice of how you deliver and fund decarbonization, obviously. So the distribution of impacts ultimately depends on the policy choices. So advice on how we can design policies that are fair and protect the lowest income households. I think there's a few steps in that process. The first one is recognizing that you have to design policy to be fair, and it sounds pretty obvious, but it's not a given. And actually, that first step is what the Treasury have recently done in their net zero review, so that's kind of a positive step forward. The second step is to make sure that you're doing things as cheaply as you can. As Emma mentioned, some of these things can be pretty expensive. So how can we make them cheaper? That's working with industry to drive down the cost of the technology through innovation, so that in the future, it's not actually adding cost to anyone anymore. And we've seen that happen with offshore wind. And as you say, we expect it'll happen with electric vehicles fairly soon too. So we need to think about doing that for more technologies that we need. So the third step is actually undertaking the analysis to see where the costs of a particular policy choice will fall, because as I said, it depends on the policy that you're looking at to deliver decarbonization. So you can do that through energy bills. Companies can fund it directly, and every choice will have different impacts on different groups. And then the last step is looking at what can you do to actually protect the groups that are vulnerable. So how can you design a policy that directly targets these groups? And there's lots of ways to do that. There's grants or benefits for the poor, for example. There are options like allocating costs onto landlord rather than tenants, so that renters are less affected. Thinking about the housing example in particular. So there's plenty of options out there. And once you recognize that this is the aim of policy, to be fair, then you just need to think carefully and design it to meet that objective. And it's certainly possible, we think, to do it without disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable people in society.
So can I just following up on that, are you saying that basically for more or less any policy, government has a choice of how to distribute the costs and benefits? And if you want to make sure that the poorest people don't pay a disproportionate amount, you need to focus on the design of the policy?
Yeah, that's essentially it. As I said, when I was kind of in the blurb saying what I do day to day, we don't think the overall costs of this are huge, but actually for a particular person, they can be huge. So yeah, we think that effective policy design can actually work to mitigate these effects and make sure that those people are protected.
Paul, can I come to you on this? Because, and I want to particularly talk about high carbon sectors. You mentioned, you don't want net zero on the back of deindustrialization. And there are some sectors which are obviously going to be affected by this. And if policy is not designed well, could easily, basically, you achieve net zero by achieving zero output. Steel is an example, chemicals and so on, the oil and gas sector, another. What are the conversations you've had with workers and indeed with management in those sectors? Does net zero feel like a threat to them? Are they coming up with their own answers on how sectors can go to net zero? What kind of conversations go on when you talk to workers in particular in those sectors?
It's a little bit like what Emma was talking about in terms of net zero and the Green New Deal. I mean, I think that policy, you mentioned the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, was the instigator behind the idea of just transition, and it's a great concept. It means absolutely nothing to the vast majority of our members working in the energy or energy intensive industries. And so I think certainly when we were sort of designing our approach to what does a just transition actually look like, Michael, one of the first things we did was go out and talk to our members in energy, in the oil and gas industry, in steel, in chemicals, in the cement industry, and ask them what they thought a just transition would look like practically on the ground. And I think that's the important thing, is actually talking about the tangible things that unions and employers can do to mitigate fears, to manage the transition, the tangible things governments can and must be doing as well to support both employers and employees. I mean, you mentioned some of those carbon intensive industries, whether it is steel or chemicals. We produced a report just a couple of months ago that said there were 660,000 jobs at risk immediately if the government didn't do more to step up its support for those carbon intensive industries. Not for them to be carbon intensive industries forevermore, but to enable them to make that transition. And, I think there is some really interesting stuff that we can do with carbon capture and storage, that we can think about how we produce new green steel, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen if we just leave it to the market, because what will happen is that those major carbon intensive companies will say, well, we can do this elsewhere. We don't need to do it in the UK. We'll do it elsewhere. And so, for our members, as I say, I'm speaking to you tonight from my shed in Birkenhead. I mean, this is a part of the country in Birkenhead that had its fair share of badly managed industrial transition, and I think we've got a responsibility to our members, not just to give them the vague exaltations that we need a green economy and green jobs and just transition. We need to show them what that practically looks like. So what the support for reskilling actually looks like. That's not just about people having access to training. It's about having the financial support to be able to take up those training opportunities, a sense that there will be jobs waiting for them at the end of those opportunities. So I suppose I'm really interested in what I would call pragmatically ambitious policies, stuff that is not in the realms of it'll never happen, but is ambitious enough that actually allows us to get to net zero, but gives people a sense that, we can see the pathway for us individually, for me as a worker, for my company and for my community at the end of it.
That takes me neatly on to you, David, because you are, you're a good company. You do the right thing. Your business is doing the right thing for other people. You attract employees, as you said, because you do the right thing. But you're not typical, if I can say this. There are many companies that are not doing that, and some that are actively kind of doing the opposite. Do you take the view that many businesses do, that this should be left to the market, and that businesses that want to do it will make money out of it, and those that don't will eventually realize that they're wrong? Or should government be forcing companies to do this effectively? Are we moving now into the mandatory realm? It was very noticeable at COP26 that Mark Carney made this big announcement on behalf of asset managers of various kinds, very large sums of money, 133 trillion under management. But it was all voluntary, and it was all going to be policed by exposure. Basically, as long as you disclose what you're doing, then nothing more will happen. Have we moved beyond that now? Should we really be requiring governments to do, businesses to do this?
Well, I think what was really interesting is I think that that government has made some quite good mandatory stuff. I mean, of course, there is all the regulation and the timescales around net zero, and Emma touched on some of those just from a building perspective. There are plenty more for vehicles, plenty more for energy mix and the like. And you're right. The government announced at COP26, first of all, that that funds and every listed company should have a transition plan, and secondly, that every company, large company, private or listed, should be disclosing their perception of climate risk, both in terms of climate change and also mitigation. So, and there is a consistent basis that investors and owners can then say, well, no, do I want to invest in that company or not? I think, Michael, the other thing I would say is that there is a lot of conversation also around a thing that we will call ambition loops, and this is where business can work in partnership with government. And so, by leaders and WSP, we would like to, as you say, see ourselves as a leader. We will then say to government and to politicians, hey, you know what, we're doing this and it's brilliant. It's helping British business differentiate. It's helping us grow. We're exporting. It's tremendous. And that gives the politicians the comfort that they can say, hey, you know what, business is after this. And they've got, so to speak, the political cover that then gives them the mandate to then set higher standards. That raises the benchmark. And then we will continue to innovate as business. And business has a tremendous role of being able to innovate faster and possibly being a bit more braver than many politicians. So that's where I think it goes hand in hand.
Can I just pick you up on that, and then I'm going to go to audience questions, because one of them is direct. I'm going to direct at Emma. Yeah. Just on that briefly, David. If you're going to get government to regulate more, to push businesses, the business voice has to be there to do it. Particularly, I would suggest with a Conservative government. Conservative governments in general don't like regulating. To be perfectly honest, Labour ones don't like it either. Is there a strong enough business voice telling government, yes, that's what you need to do?
I think it is getting much stronger, and so that's also why WSP we have a strong voice on this. It's one of our priorities to government, and why also there's these world-class organisations like Aldersgate Group and the like that have that collective voice. But you know what? You are also dead right that there are also siren voices that quietly chip in the ear of government who are not so in favour of fast action, and it is absolutely right that we do need to make sure that the business voice in favour of ambition is there, and that has a as strong, if not a stronger voice than people who are just maybe a bit more passive.
Okay, right. We're going to go to questions from the audience. Sarah has asked the question, and I'm going to ask this straight to you, Emma. Sarah asked, how do we cut through the general apathy that a lot of people seem to have about cutting carbon emissions and tackling climate change? So I'm going to ask Emma, do you think that word apathy is correct in your experience of working very locally? And if so, how have you found a way of cutting through it? What is it that has made your project, even despite the criticism that you said you were getting locally and so on, how is it that you've managed to get enough momentum to work, and how are you bringing more people on board?
I think you have to show intent and look like you aren't going to back down, and that is a tough place to be, and resilience. In terms of our policy, we always said there was no barriers to entry, and it comes back a bit to what Bianca said earlier about how do you set your policy and what your aims. No barriers to entry, so everyone can join, from an affordable housing tenant through to somebody on low income through to somebody in a large house. Nobody gets charged to coming onto the system. So they can't say, well, I can't afford it. So you've taken that away from them. And then, we're actually in the road digging it up. We've been through planning, we've done all of that stuff, and we've proved we're still going and we're delivering. And therefore, we've had far more people interested in actually signing up. The problem is we've now got temporary traffic lights. We're causing general chaos on the bypass road, and the Facebook page is going wild, not only in our village, but in the next chain of villages along. However, all news is good news for us on this project because it's highlighting what we're up to, what we're doing. And I think until there are more visible projects, people aren't really going to want to change. They don't think they have to. So our call would actually be some really key facts, like what it would cost you to do on your own, what it might cost you to do as a community, which for us is significantly less, and the fact that you've got to act now. Lots of people in their 70s think they'll die before they need to change their habits. And I think that's something that really needs to say. It's not for our children to sort out. This is for people who could be living another 10, 15 years. They're going to have to sort this out as well. And I think that's something that probably hasn't come across yet.
I want to ask both you and Bianca a question which hasn't got a person attached to it as far as I can see, but relating to the cost of net zero. Emma, you said that there was a figure that you had of 55,000 per home. I presume that's an average to retrofit. You said to get to net zero, so that's actually a huge reduction in energy usage. Bianca, you said that the whole of net zero for the UK economy would cost 1% of GDP. Do these two figures match up? Is 55,000 per home still within 1% of GDP? How do you understand this? Bianca, do you want to have a go at that? Is that a figure that you recognise, that one on the home? How do these figures match up? This gross 1% as per individual homes or individual households?
No, that's not a figure I recognize. It's kind of, I would say, probably at the very upper end of the estimates. If I think it was Emma said Cambridge Council did it based on actual homes in the area. So I'm not sure what the source is, but we have looked into this in a lot of detail, and we think that the average is quite a bit lower than that. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. It is still one of the most expensive areas to decarbonize in the whole economy, but it's certainly on average a lot less than that.
What do you think the figure is that you're working to?
I'm not really sure. I'd say that a boiler can cost up to £10,000, but a heat pump, and then retrofitting will depend a lot on the home, but not all homes need the same amount of energy efficiency retrofits. So I guess in your example, you're looking at community projects and more of a heat network. So it just depends on the solution that you're looking at.
And it also presumably depends on whether you're going net zero in every individual home, or whether you have some averaging in which you have offsets and various other things across homes. When the Labour government originally proposed all new homes to be net zero, some offsetting was allowed in places that it was more difficult to do that. So I don't really want to get into the specific numbers, but just Bianca, what are you expecting households either to pay for themselves or to have paid for by others? Could it be done by the energy companies? Could it be done by the electricity suppliers or whatever? What the kinds of sums?
Yeah, so that's the point that you make on could it be done by the energy companies. We actually have energy companies doing quite a lot and thinking about this and how can they get down the cost of, for instance, a heat pump, and in particular installing it, which tends to be the expensive thing. So we have energy companies actively kind of seeing this as an opportunity and looking to bring those costs down so that it's kind of more comparable to a gas boiler for a household, and considering that you could save money on running it potentially, depending on what electricity prices are, in particular given how expensive gas is at the moment. Eventually, as prices come down, this could come to be beneficial to households. At the moment is, as I say, quite a bit more expensive than the high carbon option, but it doesn't necessarily have to put people out of pocket. And the other thing to say is that this is a transition. So it gets said a lot in the media that gas boilers are going to be ripped out. Actually, what we assume in our scenarios is that we wait until the end of a lifetime of an asset, and then we replace that with the low carbon alternative. So it's not like once it's the time to replace your boiler, that's when you look into it. And we've worked that into kind of the transition and the pathways that we assume that still allow us to meet our targets.
And can I just ask how you take into account reductions in price through innovation or scale. So, when we first started doing renewables on a big, so I was actually working for the government at the time, when we first really said we need to increase the percentage of renewables in our energy system. This is about 2006, 7, 8, when the UK electricity system was 7% renewables, and it's now above 30%. And there have been times like in the summer where actually the use of it was much more than that. The cost of solar and wind was pretty high, but over the last decade, those two things have come down hugely. The cost of solar is about 10% of what it was then. Cost of wind between 50 and 70%. So are we expecting the cost, for example, of heat pumps and of their installation to fall? Is there a lot more innovation that is perceived to be likely? Will the scale kind of cut the costs? And how do you account for that? Emma, do you look like you wanted to answer that? And then Bianca.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the prices are a lot higher. The £40,000 is assuming that you've made some economies of scale, and there's an excellent report done by the Green Alliance and Energy Sprog. So yes, there is an expectation they come down, but the report also said it would be between £51,000 and £103,000 at the moment because of the economies of scale issue. Also, you're not thinking the heat pump at the moment is about £15,000. You've got the redecoration cost, you've got additional radiators. There's a lot more associated with those works to actually just bunging something on the side of a building. So I do think that the costs will come down, but at the moment, we shouldn't shy away from actually acknowledging how much this really does cost.
Paul, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just one thing to say, Michael, I think, I mean, actually, this is where we need to join up agendas, isn't it? Because actually, I think how we deploy these technologies and how we deliver them could have a significant bearing on the cost. So, what could be the delivery arms? It could be the energy companies. There could be a role actually for local authorities, for housing associations. I mean, at the moment, if you take sort of retrofitting insulation, I mean, I mean, our construction industry is already an industry that's beset by its fragmented, long supply chains, poor quality employment, bogus self-employment. This would be an opportunity if there's if we're talking about structural change that's going to be delivered over the course of the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there's an opportunity for government to say, well, there's a certainty in the market. There's a value in thinking about sort of how we shorten some of those supply chains, do it in a way that actually supports good quality employment so that people know that actually if I go and retrain to do this, I'll have a job for the next 5, 10 years. I mean, there's different ways of delivering this technology, which is, I mean, and I suppose my only point would be that actually it's really urgent that government gets onto this now, rather than, we set a general sort of direction and hope the market's going to fill the gaps, because I suspect we're going to have lots of individual householders paying lots of money and delivering it in a very cost inefficient way. And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the people I represent. It's not good for taxpayers.
And it must be incredibly inefficient to do random homes geographically, kind of rather than streets, whole housing associations and so on, in a kind of organized way where you both get the efficiency of kind of doing a whole street at one time, but also you get the as you say, the certainty of scale. Emma, did you want to come back? And Bianca, also, just if you've got anything. Yeah,
that's where community or town scale or city scale comes in, because this is what they've done in Denmark back in the 70s. They put all the pipe work in, they put all the heat bits into the homes, they've done all of that, but the heat source can change. So you can carry on decarbonising. So they started off with wood chip boilers, now they're moving to industrial air source. And so therefore, as a community, it's so easy to move with the technologies rather than digging up, cutting homes open, etc. in the future. So actually a collective way is cheaper, and it's better in terms of collective change going forward. But we're not reinventing the wheel. This is what they do in Europe.
Bianca, anything to add on innovation and kind of cost reduction over time?
Yeah, I have a point to make on that, but before, just on the point of doing things locally, one of the things, we do know that the best solution, we don't know what they are, but we know that they'll vary locally. And in some areas, say dense areas, we can have heat networks. In some areas, a hydrogen boiler might be best. In some areas, a heat pump. So one of the things the government is looking at is kind of zoning, looking into heat zoning. So that's something that is being considered. And on the point of costs coming down, so you asked how we factor those in, and we do make assumptions in kind of all of our analysis about technological improvements. The more that we roll something out, the more that we do something, the better that we get at it and the cheaper that it gets. We are very conservative in our assumptions on that. And actually, we have tended to underestimate the potential for cost reductions. So as I said, our latest estimates suggest that achieving net zero in aggregate is less than 1% of GDP. When we did this work back in 2019, so just 2 years ago, we thought it was 1 to 2% of GDP, and that came down just because of the reductions in renewables. And actually back in 2008, when we recommended a target of 80% reductions by 2050, we thought that would cost 1 to 2% of GDP. So that just goes to show you the incredible potential that there is for innovation to bring down costs in particular, as we roll things out. And, we have to do something about 25 million homes. So actually the scale of that is actually huge. And there's a lot of potential for improvements as we get better at doing things.
And it's worth saying, I think, and David, I'm sure you will confirm this, or I'm going to ask you a different question in a second. There is a kind of virtuous circle here between policy and innovation and cost, and indeed international agreements, to be perfectly honest, given that we're talking just after COP26. What the climate process internationally is designed to do is to get every country to act simultaneously rather than just kind of whenever it suits an individual country domestically. That's what international agreements do. That means you get global scale for the technologies. We're not just doing it in 1 or 2 places, we're doing it all over the world. That will tend to reduce costs. It provides an incentive for innovative companies to improve the performance of the technology and to reduce it. If the costs come down, that then allows you to do more of it, which means that you can strengthen your policy framework, and that then increases demand again. So there is and I think we've got pretty good evidence on that kind of virtuous circle of policy, innovation, cost, and indeed international agreement. But that's not what I want to ask you about, David. We've had also another question come in from somebody who's not put their name down about absolute zero and net zero. This relates to research which suggests that the kind of net zero which is being discussed at the UNFCCC, the COP, is not possible. The models rely in the later years on the kind of very uncertain and possibly fictional technologies of carbon capture in some form by nature. There may not be enough land and vegetation to do it. The idea of net zero is that there will always be some emissions and they need to be captured. But also the concept of net zero is being used in the business world for some companies to say we're going net zero. And then when you interrogate what they mean by that, they mean by they're buying offsets. And the airline companies, the oil and gas companies saying we're going net zero. And what they actually mean is we're going to try and buy some forest somewhere in the developing world. What's your view on when you're advising companies, when you're helping them to decarbonize, what do you say about absolute zero, net zero, offsetting, and those debates?
I think there's 2 points. So first of all, I think there will always be a small number of emissions. Let's take the smallest landfill site that is emitting a small amount of methane. It would be incredibly costly to have to capture that element of and retrofit the landfill. So that is where things like green spaces, restoring peat, and the like. These are areas that our biodiversity folks are working hard on. That has a really great opportunity and a role. And you know what? Isn't that tremendous as well to be able to create green spaces in cities and the like? It makes it a nicer place to live as well. Your point on net zero for companies, again, I absolutely recognize that as a challenge. And you know what, again, one of the big COP successes that we see as business is that for the first time, there is now an international definition of what companies, if they want to make a net zero claim, what that means. And that's both in terms of the scope, so what you would cover in that, and also a requirement that if you're then going to use offsets, that you should only be using that across your direct emissions and also your upstream and downstream emissions from your supply chain and your products. You can only use offsets for the last 10% of the balance. And that is a really good beef up to exactly to your point, whoever it was who raised the question, to get over some of that greenwash.
And interestingly, the UN Secretary General at the COP said he was setting up an expert committee to look at the claims of net zero and so on, and to try and help develop a standard so we would avoid what's often called greenwashing. And
but I hope, Paul, Michael, also, I mean, let's also hope that doesn't just kick this whole thing into the long grass. Science-based targets have been working on this for the last 2 years. They've been consulting on a draft of what that corporate net zero is now. So our feedback to that UN process is, you know what, do your boundary scan, but just darn well, let's not have another 3 years of faffing around when we've got a really robust standard that launched in the week before COP.
That point is heard. A very quick question for you, Bianca, and then I want to have a final question for all of you. Bianca, on one of the questioners has asked about transport. And this is a kind of pretty quick answer, I hope, will electrified transport, buses, vans, as well as cars, in the end make transport cheaper and allow fares to come down? Or is your sense that, basically this is going to be a more expensive way of getting around and we are going to see higher fares?
Well, our expectation is that all of those modes of transport are cheaper to run. So cars, vans are cheaper to run on electricity. They are at present. So we think actually in all our analysis, that's a cost saving, is one of the biggest cost savings in the economy. So what that means in terms of fares, I guess, is again a question of how policy is designed and how that the choice to feed that through to consumers. But for example, a person purchasing a car, that is already cheaper to run that car on electricity than on petrol. And as it gets cheaper on a lifetime basis, the savings that you'll make will be even more significant. So it is what we see to be one of the biggest savings, really, of decarbonization. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's happening because it's going to be cheaper. So we already see it picking up steam, and we think that will carry on at pace.
Okay, great. Look, we're very nearly at the end. These things go very quickly, particularly when you're having fun. I want to ask a final question, which very conveniently is the question I was actually going to ask you all anyway, but I can now claim that it's an audience question since a member of the audience has also asked this. So for each of you, you have 1 minute, in fact, 43 seconds each. What is the one thing that you would like government to do, a policy change or some other, that would make the most difference to the UK's decarbonisation over the next period? I am going to start with you, Bianca.
So I'm going to cheat a little and say that there is no single thing because there's no silver bullet.
Cheating.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at a progress report to government, so that's a report where we track government progress and we say, what do you need to do in the next year? We have over 200 recommendations in there in the last one. So there's a whole lot to do in every single sector. There isn't a single solution. So the main thing I'd say that they need to do is just to get on with it, really.
So you heard it here first. I've asked the panelists, what is the one thing that should be done? And she says there are 200 things that should be done. David, what's your answer to this question?
So I completely agree with Bianca. My one policy would be give local authorities the ability to raise funds to deliver net zero in their regions.
Excellent. That takes us to a whole new debate about localism and local devolution and various other things. Paul, the one thing you would like to see government do, or you'd like some new policy?
I'd like the government to embed voice and agency, I think, Michael, in this process, so that net zero is something that's done with people rather than to them. I'd like them to implement all the recommendations of the Green Jobs Task Force, but in particular that recommendation around a National Just Transition Commission. And then, and embed that at every level. So at a company level, companies are required not just to produce just transition plans, but just transition plans where they can demonstrate they've involved their workforce, their local communities, other key stakeholders. I mean, this is stuff that we should be getting on with. It doesn't cost government a penny, and it concentrates the minds of those in our boardrooms.
Thank you. And Emma?
I think it's actually publicity of good projects and insisting that actually some of our media channels broadcast these out, be it the Daily Mail, be it whatever online. But I think this has to come thick and fast, and I think the messaging has to be in really plain English that people understand they do have to change.
Well, thank you all. That answer, Emma, very interestingly echoes one of the things I think we thought on the IPPR Environmental Justice Commission, which was we ran these fascinating citizens' juries with ordinary citizens looking at things, being given information by experts, and they came up with really interesting recommendations. But of course, by the end of the process, they were no longer ordinary citizens because they were then very well informed. And I think we all felt we have to get the experience that ordinary people had of thinking about this a bit harder than they would have done otherwise to a wider public. It's no good just a few tens of people understanding this well. This needs to be a much bigger public debate. And I hope that in our own small way, we have contributed here to that public debate, public understanding of the issues. I hope we've illuminated a few things. For those people who found this so riveting that you'd like to see it again, it is available, or it will be available on YouTube, and it will remain on the YouTube channel. And if you thought it was sufficiently interesting that other people should see it, please do tell them about it. Can I thank Lynette Hodges and Adam McSweeney of the University of Sheffield for their help in organising this, and technically it seems to have all gone reasonably well, assuming that is that we've got an audience, because of course we have no idea whether anybody is actually watching or listening to this, but assuming they are, I hope you've enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you to our panelists, to Bianca, David, Paul and Emma, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.